What is up, everybody? I am Get Flinged, and the red dot versus reflex versus holographic debate is as old as Rainbow Six Siege itself, and there are very passionate people on each side of this debate. Now, I've been using red dot a lot lately, and trust me, if you want to trigger somebody, show them gameplay of you using a red dot. People lose their minds when they see it. And I wanted to make a video today talking and comparing these three sites. I'm not going to be trying to talk anybody into using the red dot. I'm not going to be talking about which site is the best necessarily. I'm just going to be showing pros and cons of each, because the fact of the matter is that each of these three sites, Reflex, Red Dot, and Holographic, have pros and cons to each. They're actually very well balanced, which is a great accomplishment from the developers. A lot of games, you have a go-to site, one site that is the clear winner. And if you have it, you use it. And when it comes to these three sites in Rainbow Six Siege, again, they're pretty well balanced. And at the end of the day, it's going to come down to personal preference. So the goal of this video, I'm going to show you some graphical kind of illustrations of these sites, comparing them to each other. I'm going to talk to you about what I feel the pros and cons are of each of them. And then hopefully you can make an informed decision when you're figuring out which one is best for you. But just remember, at the end of the day, it's going to be personal preference, and only you can decide which one is your preference. One final note before we go into the meat of this video, and that is that we're only comparing these three sites. We're not going to be comparing the one-off sites, like for example, that red dot that Clash has, the Vortex site, I believe is what it's called, that Nook and Mozzie have available to them. We're just going to be comparing these three main sites. With that said, let's get into the comparisons, and a couple of terms that I'm going to be using that I want to make sure we're all on the same page of is reticle, sight window, and casing. The reticle is actually the sight. So on the red dot sight, the reticle would be that red dot. The sight window is that area from that reticle out to the casing, and the casing being the actual plastic or metal part of the sight itself. So those are three terms that I'm going to be using a lot here. I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page as far as what those terms mean. So let's start out here by talking about the Reflex first. And I think that the pros and cons with the Reflex are that it by far has the best casing in the game. And by best, I mean smallest. So the Reflex casing is by far the smallest casing between the three sites. And that's a good thing because it takes up less of your total screen. It means that you're going to have less of a chance of that casing covering up an enemy and putting that enemy in a position where you don't see them on your screen because it's being blocked by that casing. So that's definitely a pro of the Reflex. That small casing is very desirable. Now on the screen right now, you're seeing me holding the same angle using a Reflex and a red dot, and just kind of going back and forth as far as the opacity and which one I'm highlighting on the screen. And in doing this, you can really see the difference in size of the casing of the Reflex versus the casing of the red dot, and how much less of the screen is taken up by the casing of that Reflex. And that's definitely a pro. You can also see from this what, in my opinion, is a negative with the Reflex, and that is how small that sight window is. When you compare the sight window of that red dot with the sight window of the Reflex, you see how much more of the screen is inside of that sight window of the red dot compared to that Reflex. That's not necessarily a deal breaker, but it is a negative in my opinion. So those are two facts that I'll say with the Reflex. It has the smallest casing and also the smallest sight window of all three of the sights in the game. Now getting into more of an opinion aspect of the Reflex, we're going to talk about the reticle. The reticle of the Reflex is that small green triangle. And on the screen right now, I'm showing you a clip of why I just simply don't get along with it very well. It has to do with the feedback that I get from that reticle. And what you're seeing here is me lining up Valk at a decent long shot here and firing just above her head. And whenever I'm using the red dot, it very clearly says to me, you are firing above Valk's head. But whenever I'm using that Reflex, in my mind, that looks like it could possibly land on Valk's head. Now, what this has to do with is the fact that the reticle of the Reflex, the bullet lands at the very tip top of that triangle. And that's by design. This isn't like a bug or anything like that. Please don't, think that's what I'm saying. But I've just never been able to train myself to look at that reticle that way. I've always looked at it the same way I look at that red dot. So for me, in the blink of an eye, whenever I'm lining up shots with that red dot reticle, I get better feedback and more accurate feedback on that reticle compared to the reticle of the Reflex. With that said, I will say if you do train yourself to aim at the very tip of that triangle, there is an advantage to that. You're going to be able to have the tip of that triangle on a head in a pixel angle and still be able to see around that tip. Whereas the red dot, when it's on the head, it kind of covers the whole head depending on the range and everything. So, that again, it's personal preference. If you train yourself to use the reflex the way it's intended, then I could see that reticle actually being a pro instead of a con for a lot of people. Okay, let's move on to the red dot. And on the screen right now, I'm comparing the red dot with the holographic. Now, as far as the red dot versus reflex, we already had that up on the screen, but the red dot has a bigger sight window. It also has a bigger casing, a casing that takes up more of the screen. But in my opinion, I prefer the reticle of the red dot over the reflex. When you're comparing the red dot with the holographic, just eyeballing it, I didn't take any exact measurements here. To me, it looks like the sight window of the red dot and the holographic are about the same, really close to about the same. And when you look at the casing, I actually think the casing of the red dot might be a little bit less. Now, it's different. The holographic casing, as you can see, is really thick down at the bottom, okay? And it takes up a lot of room down there. But the red dot casing takes up maybe a little bit more room around the right and left side. So it's kind of a give and take there. But to me, when you look at it as a whole, it does look to me like the casing of the red dot is smaller and takes up less of your screen than the casing of the holographic. Okay, getting into the reticle of the red dot, again, we're going to be talking mostly personal preference here, but I will say that I think it's probably the easiest to use and the easiest to get feedback on in the middle of a gunfight. With that said, it's probably the worst, in my opinion, on holding long-range pixels because, as I mentioned earlier, at long range, when you have that red dot over a head, it's going to basically cover that entire head, whereas the holographic has that really, really tiny dot in the middle of that kind of crosshair. So it's easier to hold pixels probably with the holographic than with the red dot, and if you're using the reflex the way it's intended, it's probably easier to do that as well. So for me, whenever I summarize the red dot, it comes in with the best sight window. It's probably a tie between that and the holographic. It might come down to personal preference. Do you prefer a circular sight window versus a square sight window? That might be decide which one's best for you there. As far as the casing, it's probably in between the reflex and the holographic, in my opinion. Reflex has the smallest casing, holographic has the biggest casing. Red dot's right in the middle there. And then as far as the reticle is the easiest for me to use, and I get the best feedback in the middle of a gunfight from this reticle. With that said, I do think it's probably the worst reticle for holding pixel angles because, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to cover that pixel pretty solidly if you're trying to hold that. Okay, moving on to the holographic, and I'll admit that the holographic is probably the sight that I've spent the least amount of time with, but after doing the research for this video and seeing these comparisons, I'm going to give it another look. I might try using the holographic more and more and seeing how this works out. So the big thing with the holographic, as you can see on the screen here, we're comparing the casing of the red dot with the holographic. You can see just how big the casing of the holographic is, especially at the bottom. It's actually thinner around the edges, but that bottom casing is just so thick and takes up a lot of the screen right there. The question is, how does that affect you? And is that going to be a turnoff for you? That's going to answer whether or not this sight is going to be good for you or not, in my opinion. Because the sight window, again, I mentioned earlier, it's pretty much the same as the red dot and bigger than the reflex. And the reticle of the holographic might be the best in every situation. If you really think about it, for me, if you're holding pixels, the holographic is probably the best. The one drawback I would say of the reticle of the holographic is that maybe in the middle of a gunfight, it's a little bit tough to get feedback from because of how thin it is. You know, that reticle is really thin. The crosshair is kind of thin, but that's kind of nitpicking. And again, it's going to be different for everybody. I'm not sure how big of a deal that's going to actually be. And there's no doubt if you're holding pixels, in my opinion, the best reticle of all three is going to be the holographic to hold a pixel with. To me, the big question with the holographic is that casing. Is that casing going to be acceptable for you? There's no doubt about it. That casing is really, really thick at the bottom, and that could possibly, cause situations where it's covering up an enemy and it doesn't allow you to see them, resulting in a death that's going to be really frustrating. The red dot casing is the same, but it's on the right and left side. So at the end of the day, I think that's a question you have to answer. Would you rather have the casing thicker on the right and left side versus the bottom? And I'm not sure which is better, to be honest. Okay, so there it is. That's my summary of the Reflex, red dot, and holographic sights in the game. Hopefully this allows you to make an informed decision. Remember, no matter what anybody says, at the end of the day, it's your choice. All three of these sights are viable, and that's quite an accomplishment from the developers that they made these sights so balanced, and I really like that aspect of the game. So figure out what your preference is, and don't be afraid to switch, because the honest truth is that most players, myself included, we have moods where one day the red dot will be the best sight we've ever used, and then a month later we'll be throwing the reflex back on everything. I'm going to start trying the holo a little bit more than I have. I think I've been sleeping on that sight a little bit, and from this testing, I see a lot of the pros of that sight. With that said, go in, mess around with the sights, see which one works for you, and hopefully this video helps you make that decision. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure that you like and subscribe, and I'll have more coming your way here soon.